This is an overview video on how to answer question 3 on paper 1 section B. The idea of this video is that you can understand what the examiner is expecting and what you can do to score as many marks as you can. Now the question will always look like this. First of all, they'll give you a statement, so an opinion for example. Then ask, how far do you agree? Explain your answer. You may use the following in your answer, then it will give you 2 stimulus points. You must also use information of your own here. Now this is for 16 marks, but there are additional 4 marks available for your spelling, punctuation and grammar. So altogether this is worth 20 marks. So it's important that we get it right. 10 marks here are available for AO2, which is your analysis of either causation or consequence. Now that will depend on the specific question that you get. So you need to work out, are they asking you why something happened, so to address the factors that cause something? Or are you looking at the consequences of something that happened, of a particular development, and sort of the significant implications of that development? Whether it's causation or consequence, the most important thing you need to do here is make a judgment. The question has asked you how far you agree with the statement, so you need to either agree or disagree. And it really doesn't matter which one you go for, there's no right or wrong answer. The only important thing really is how well you can explain why you think what you do. Essentially, this means considering lots of information, so evidence from your own knowledge, the stimulus points in the question, and reaching a judgment. Remember that analysis, like it says in AO2, is just about explaining yourself. You just need to explain why you think that particular thing. Which brings us on to AO1, which is worth the next 6 marks, and that is for your knowledge and understanding of the period. So when you're explaining your judgment or how far you agree with the statement, you need to be drawing on bits of evidence from your own knowledge. That doesn't just mean writing down absolutely everything that you know. It's really important to do well in AO1 that you're picking precise and judicious bits of evidence from your knowledge to support what you're saying. That shows the examiner that you know your stuff and that you're really confident with the judgment that you've made. The remaining 4 marks are for your spelling, punctuation and grammar, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail in a minute. Remember that you don't have to use the stimulus material given to you in the question, it's just there as a prompt. If you do include the stimulus material, make sure that it's not the only evidence that you have. You still really need to be bringing in stuff from your own knowledge for that AO1, for those 6 marks there. This is because in the higher bands there are what are called mark ceilings. So if you aren't bringing in your own knowledge, you actually can't get the higher marks in this question. So it's really important that you are using evidence from the stuff that you already know. It's also important to note that the AOs depend on each other, so that means that no matter how well you do in one of the AOs, if your performance isn't quite as good in the other, or if you haven't included any of the other one, then it does unfortunately hold you back. So make sure that you're analysing the particular second order concept in the question, but you're using your own knowledge to support that. It's really, really important that you're addressing both of the AOs. Now this definitely seems like a lot of information, but there are just a few key things that you really need to remember when you're answering this question. The first is to focus on the question, keep what you're saying relevant. Now I'm sure that you know lots about the topic already, so try and really focus what you're saying on the question, keep it specific. The second thing is that you need to make a judgment, so you need to decide how far you agree and explain why. That essentially is your AO2 in your analysis. These are the bottom 2 bands for this question. Now you might notice that within each band there are 4 marks available. There are 3 bullet points on the right hand side. Now the first bullet point is for AO2 and that addresses the quality of your comparison. The second bullet point is for AO1 and that is for the knowledge and understanding that you use to support that comparison. And the final bullet point is also for AO2 and that is on your overall judgment and the structure of your judgment, so kind of how clearly you express what you think. The examiner will consider the first 2 bullet points together and give you up to 3 marks depending on how well you've done on those first 2. They will then consider the final bullet point on its own and that will be worth the last mark, the 4th mark. So maybe just bear that in mind when you're writing your answer. You now know what the examiner is looking for and what they need to be able to tick off in order to score you in the higher bands. These are the top 2 bands for this question. Generally speaking, to progress in AO2, you need to show that you've progressed from the general comments to the analytical comments. So not just making overarching sort of statements that you haven't really explained or maybe aren't so relevant to the question, and rather being analytical, so explaining what you're thinking, being specific, drawing in evidence to explain yourself. And that brings us on to AO1. So again, not just sort of general bits of knowledge that you might have, but actually really specific things that can show how much you know about the topic and support that judgment that you've just made. A final important thing to mention is that there is a heavy weighting on AO2, so that is for your evaluation and your analysis. That really comes down to making sure that you've got a judgment. So remember, the question has asked you, how far do you agree? So you need to state clearly what you think and then explain consistently throughout your answer why you think that. And it's only by showing that judgment that really you can score in the top bands here, so just make it as clear as you can. There are also 4 marks available in this question for spelling, punctuation and grammar, or SPAG, which means that this question is worth 20 marks altogether, so quite a significant portion of the paper. Now, if you do find spelling and punctuation and grammar a little bit difficult, then don't worry too much, because you still can get a couple of marks here, even if you've got a few mistakes in there. But maybe this is just a reminder to write a bit more slowly and just be a bit more cautious over those spellings as you go. You might also notice that to get the highest number of marks here, that it asks for specialist vocabulary. What's important though is that you don't just put it there for the sake of it, because if you try and shove it in where it doesn't really fit, then that might impact your mark for sort of the flow of the argument, because it might not quite make sense. So if you are using specialist vocabulary, then that's great. Try and make sure it's spelled correctly if there are words that you aren't too familiar with. But don't worry about just trying to get it in there for the sake of it. You can still do very well in SPAG without specialist vocabulary. You might even be using it without realising, so really don't worry. Finally, let's take a look at an example to see all of this put into action. Now, this example is taken from the warfare option, and the statement is, the role of the commander was the most significant contributor to British losses at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. You may use the following in your answer: General Haig, the War of Attrition. You must also use information of your own. 16 marks. Total for spelling, punctuation, grammar and use of specialist terminology, 4 marks, for a total of 20 marks. These are points that you could have included, so as you can see, the mark scheme will always have points for supporting the statement and for countering the statement. So again, it really doesn't matter which one you choose, as long as you can explain why you think that. The evidence here shows that really good specific knowledge, and it's this sort of specific and relevant detail that you really need to kind of support yourself and score in the higher bands.